On March 17, 2021, a lone gunman in Atlanta, Georgia went on a racially motivated rampage, killing 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. This act of violence against the Asian community is one of the most recent examples of the steady increase in hate crimes and discrimination. In this episode, we will be talking about anti-Asian racism, some of the drivers for the instances in the last 12 to 14 months, xenophobia in the broader context of this pandemic, and how COVID-19 has exacerbated racist sentiments.
This is the Public Health Insight Podcast.
My name is Will, your host for this episode, and I'm here with co-hosts LaShawn, Linda, and Gordon.
Before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent any of the organizations we work for or are affiliated with.
Public Health Insight stands in solidarity with the Asian community as we mourn the loss. We stand against any and all forms of racism and discrimination. Please also note that this episode may contain sensitive or triggering content for some people. We encourage you to use your discretion when listening to this content and connect to the appropriate supports as needed. As we've discussed many times on this podcast, racism is a public health crisis at its core. And to guide our discussion today, we will hone in on the concept of racism in a bit more detail. So, as we mentioned kind of earlier, and I think even in our earlier episodes related to racism, we made it plenty clear that racism is very much a public health issue. Maybe just as a quick introduction, and when you think of racism, let's try to define or come to some working definition that we can carry throughout this episode for what really is racism. Because I think it's one of those terms that we all, we hear it often. We all understand what it is, but I think it's still important to kind of come to some sort of agreement here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a really good point. Often people may throw around the word racism or racist, and I think at this point it can very much be overused, that it could either lose meaning or we forget what it actually refers to. But for me, I think of racism always has a lens of power. So it's prejudice, it's discrimination on the basis of race, but there is that lens of a power dynamic, that there's a hierarchy. So because you have a different racial background than me, I am superior to you. And so in the context of North America, at least where we're speaking of, in general, the hierarchy is whiteness at the top and everybody else at the bottom. Yeah,
that's a really good foundation that you established for us, Linda. I think that idea of the power dynamics really, I personally think is really central to this discussion of racism. And for me, when I hear racism, what immediately comes to mind is the idea of othering, and using characteristics, whether it's I guess in the situation or the context of racism, that being race, oftentimes by other biological kind of indicators like skin tone, facial features, etc., to, like you said, create a hierarchy, create a gradient, and then kind of overlapping almost a power scale along that gradient, right? And I think that's very much, you can't, racism without discussions of power, I think there isn't a discussion, period.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have that power dynamic there.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing I think that we can't forget when we talk about racism, and we mentioned this before, is that it's not just on that interpersonal level, that when we look at our socio-ecological model, racism exists on so many different levels that it can be even internalized, and then it can be interpersonal, it can be within the community, and it can be at the level of the institution. And what we have seen, throughout this past year, and even with regards to anti-Asian racism, many people want to say, I personally am not racist, so how can there be racism when, I've never said anything? But the way our institutions are set up too, our systems, racism is embedded there.
Yeah, exactly. And then just to wrap that up a bit as well, even at the policy level, as we will get to today, there are many ways that this can take form.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great points from all here. And I think, one of the main reasons why I really felt a need to discuss this topic. I feel that first off, it's an issue that's after what happened in Atlanta. It kind of came to front lines and became more well known. But the reality is, anti-Asian racism isn't like a new thing. It's not something that just kind of popped into the scene with COVID. And so it's there's, I think when we talk about anti-Asian racism, it's very important to reiterate here that this is a topic with very deep historical roots and has affected communities, individuals, families, and people for centuries. And the second point I want to kind of preface before we continue with our discussion is that although the recent news headlines are mostly based in the United States, for example, the gunman who went on the rampage and killing 6 Asian women in Atlanta, or the various violence against elderly Asian people, whether in the West Coast or in the East Coast. Despite all these kind of instances being focused in the U.S., it's important for us here in Canada to recognize that anti-Asian racism is not isolated to the U.S. It's not isolated to other countries, but it's also as much prevalent in our own countries, in our own communities. And I think that's a very important thing to note, because oftentimes when we hear of these tragedies or these very disgusting acts, it's very easy for us to point fingers and be like, oh, that's a their issue, that's a them issue. It doesn't affect us. We're all living here, in our utopia, not having to deal with any of this. But I think that's the thoughts like that is very problematic, because it, in a way, reduces the importance of the issue that we're speaking to today. So I just wanted to preface by noting these two things.
I think it's also important to mention, as we did with the anti-Black racism episode, is that when we're talking about this, anti-Asian racism, we can't treat that as a monolithic group. So we have to understand that even within that grouping, there are many different groups, such as Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and there's so many, right? So what we'll also get into in this episode is that when we're looking at this kind of overall cluster, we have to realize that classifying them as a huge group also can have damaging effects. So just wanted to note that at the beginning.
It's a very good point with Sean, and it's a good preview for what's to come later in the episode. So yeah, I think as we tend to do with most of our topics, it's important to always look back in history and kind of see what are some what kind of led to what we're dealing with today. Because, as mentioned, anti-Asian racism, at least in Canada, is not a new phenomenon, right? Even anti-Asian racism in the context of a pandemic is not a new phenomenon. With COVID-19, I'm sure we all remember, back in the early 2000s with the SARS pandemic, and how individuals who, of Asian descent, were reported to have been verbally, physically, attacked, far more greater proportion compared to other individuals. And I think we're seeing very similar situations nowadays with COVID. So it took place early last year. So in February of 2020, I was on a train going from Toronto, Ontario to Ottawa, and this was more than, I would say, almost 20 years since SARS. And for me personally, I haven't experienced the level of overt public racism as I did during those SARS times. And it took me by surprise, because I was on the train, and it was right when COVID was starting to pop up again, to pop up in Canada at least, and starting to hit news media and outlets and things like that. And there's this gentleman who was seated beside me, and he looked at me, and he waved over one of the train attendants workers and asked to be relocated. And the lady was kind of confused. She's like, "Oh, is something wrong? Is this the incorrect seat?" And the gentleman straight up said, "Oh no, with everything going on with this new virus, you can never be too safe, haha." And I honestly, at the time, I I hit him back with a very blunt response. I told him that just because you're sitting beside, a Chinese person doesn't mean you're gonna get the vaccine. Doesn't mean you're gonna get the virus. And looking back, it was very shocking, but also not shocking at the same time, because it was shocking in that for someone to be so publicly dropping these kind of racist sentiments, it was definitely took me by surprise. But it wasn't shocking because as I've experienced throughout my life, and as all of you have mentioned earlier, racism comes in many forms, right? And you have those publicly overt, like in your face type racists who really scream slurs and like make fun of you, and there are those other individuals who who continue to tap into the system that's already established to be full of inequalities and discrimination, prejudice, etc. So yeah, it's definitely a tough topic for sure, and I think I'm glad we were able to dive a bit deeper into it today.
So what are some of those historical examples that you're aware of?
Yeah, so the being ethnically Chinese, the two that really stand out to me is, so the first one, it was known as the Chinese head tax, and it was something that the government of Canada implemented in the 1880s, so like 1885, and it required that each Chinese immigrant entering Canada be subject to a fee, which is why it was coined the head tax. And these fees started out initially at around $50 and eventually rose to as high as $500. And for us nowadays, it's if we take away all those other kind of factors and just consider the money amount, people might think, $50, that's not too bad. But I think it's even just looking at pure economics, at that time, $500 is equivalent to 2 years wages for your average labor. So imagine being charged the equivalent of 2 years wages in order to even be considered, or to come and immigrate to this country. Oftentimes people don't immigrate for no reason. It's most times people immigrate in order to look for a better life or to escape from some sort of persecution or violence. So it's almost like, it's like, here, come to our country and then pay us this absurd amount of money. It's just this, a part of it just doesn't sit right with me.
It could be veiled as, we're simply just trying to, I don't even know how they could veil it, just as a normal process of a fee for immigration, but really it's a deterrent. We don't want you to come to this country. But in a way, it shows how sinister racism can be, because it can be veiled under policy, but it's actually furthering like a racist mindset.
The Chinese Exclusion Act, that's the law in the United States, was kind of passed around the same time in 1882 or 1883. So were the two kind of related? So it sounds like Canada went the more subtle route of, let's put up some kind of barrier that likely not many people will be able to overcome, and then the US kind of just flat out banned without any way for Asians to enter United States to build any kind of life.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you raised, Gordon, and it's a good segue, because actually in Canada, not long after, in 1923, Canada, we implemented our own version of this, known as the Chinese Immigration Act, and this lasted from 1923 to 1947, and it was essentially just exactly like you said, banned Chinese immigration, except for certain kind of exceptions. So I think some exceptions were if you were a foreign student, if you were a diplomat, if you had some sort of special clearance given by the government, etc. But for the vast majority of individuals, from Chinese people during this time who wanted to come to Canada, it was the immigration was controlled. And just for a bit of historical context, from 1923 to 1947, that was a very unstable period in Chinese history. That was periods of war, famine, social unrest. Millions of people died during this time, and if we look back at subsequent kind of periods of unrest around the world, whether it be the Korean War or the Vietnam War, or current or conflicts in the Middle East, in Europe or other places around the world, Africa, Latin America, during periods like this, it was common for high income countries to accept and bring in refugees or immigrants who are seeking to escape these events. But just to me, it just seemed like this period for the Chinese, a lot of people could have had the opportunity, if this act wasn't in place, to escape and actually restart their lives. But instead, it's you never know. Countless people end up dying. I would say as a result of this. And it was also very interesting because this act, in Canada, we've seen periods of where the government has controlled or kind of, I guess, placed limits for immigration from certain countries. But the Chinese Immigration Act was the first instance where a select nationality of people were banned completely, or more or less completely. And it was a very targeted policy focusing on Chinese people.
And you just want to jump in here too, because you mentioned this is the first instance of a specific nationality being restricted. So that's a very firm statement that we do not want you here. But if we look prior to this, like in the 1800s, late 1800s, a lot of Chinese laborers were building our country, building our railway system. They were contributing to building this economy here. And then all of a sudden our government turns around and says, bye. And so to me, that's like, how do you justify that? How could Canadians watch that and say nothing? And I wasn't around, so I can't comment there, but it just, when you look back in context of what happened before, it just seems so, how could we be that bad? How could Canada have done something like that when we claim to be such a pillar of human rights,
Yeah. And it very much, for me, that idea of, despite the early Chinese laborers building the country, it's almost as if, those early individuals were never viewed as human.
Yes.
In a way, it's like, you're nothing less than a source of manual labor. And, when push comes to shove, stay out of the country kind of thing. Yeah.
And then at the same time, it's like, why are we surprised? Because this country has been dehumanizing people from time, and we still continue to do that.
So is there any we're keep in mind we're still in like the mid 1900s and we haven't even made our way up to recent days. So is there anything more recent time that you're aware of, Will?
So I wanted to mention another incident. It was kind of in the early 1900s, and because kind of our conversations so far has seemed to been around Chinese nationals or people of Chinese descent, I wanted to mention so it was called the Komagata Maru incident. It's based, so it's named after a steamship that was based in Japan, and essentially, to my understanding, what happened was that this ship was carrying around 400 South Asian passengers, mainly from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka area, and they were headed for Canada. And upon arrival at Canada, they were denied entry, and this was also, part of the government of Canada's attempt to restrict immigration from, what were then known as the British India. So, the British Empire's kind of colony in India, and I think part of it was because of, there was a recent wave of, large numbers of people from British India immigrating to various countries and so the governments felt that there was a need to really restrict it. And so essentially this ship was asked to turn back and go back to India, and only allowed around 20 people to actually enter the country. And I'm not too sure about what were the actual political kind of factors in play in India at the time, but once the ship turned back, there were resulting riots, and numerous people who were on the ship were either arrested or died as a result. So it just kind of shows a couple of things. It shows one that I guess Asians as a whole, not just East Asians, but also South Asians, were very much subjected to a lot of this same racism that are experienced. And another thing that I think it signifies is that a lot of these issues work in almost a domino effect, right? It's because the boat was not about to come in, and I'm sure there are other factors, but essentially, because it had to get turned around, it ended up resulting in numerous people dying. And a lot of these things could have been prevented, and it's just there really is. I'm really kind of lost for words to really describe it.
It sounds almost like, it actually is this similar mindset with the Chinese head tax or with the Immigration Act. It's, again, we don't want you here. Under a veil of policy, whichever excuse they use, perhaps the people on the ship didn't have, didn't use the proper channels to come. Who knows what reasons were used? But it's like we're trying to maintain this country the way the Eurocentric, majority of the country. We do not want you here, and then people die as a result. And
I guess the last example that for Canada that really comes to mind for me, and I'm sure we've all heard about this, through history class or whatever other means, is the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. It's essentially it's as it sounds. Between 1941 and 1949, around 90% of all of the total Japanese Canadian population were sent to internment camps in the British Columbia interior. And businesses were confiscated, land were taken back by the government, and I found this to be very problematic, and just one of the examples that really signifies anti-Asian racism in Canada, because it's during the war, sure, we're all aware that the Japanese were on the I guess Axis forces, but they weren't the only ones that were kind of that the Allies were fighting against. But what made it really mind-boggling is that they only sent the Japanese Canadians into these internment camps. And through my research, I was curious. I was like, did they ever just decide to round up all the German Canadians, all the Italian Canadians, and put them in the camps? No. It was like, I think very few numbers of them were rounded up, if any, and the individuals who were gathered had clear, very vocal affiliation with the Nazi Party in Canada. And so it's like, if your justification is that these individuals might have espionage ties, or might be a national security threat, then why not just it's like I'm not promoting it, but it's like, why not actually kind of follow your reasoning and round up anyone who could potentially be a threat? Yeah, and it's really sad.
Unless you're directly targeting Asians.
Yeah, because a lot of the individuals who were rounded up were Canadian, by birth. So it's like you're not even targeting.
Wow.
Yeah, that also ties into the jumping even 40, 50 years ahead to the murder of Vincent Chin in the United States. So my understanding of that situation is this was a man who identified as Chinese and who worked at a Chrysler plant in Detroit, like a car motor plant. And I think there were two white men who I'm not sure if they were laid off, but this man essentially was beaten by those two white men because he was essentially blamed for them being laid off because of the success of the Japanese kind of motor industry.
Yeah.
And he was seen as kind of a proxy for that, even though he wasn't even identifying as Japanese. So that's where the stereotypes too is very harmful. It's just like all Asian are the same, it's all your fault. And then you have very horrible stories like this where this man had nothing to do with anything, and his life was ended, and his life was changed forever.
And interesting when you talk about this Vincent Chin incident, so these white men had been laid off, so their economic prosperity is being threatened. And so it's again that power and access to resources. When you feel there's a threat, then it's let's, crack down on everyone who is the other, everyone who may be trying to threaten our position of privilege.
Yeah, very much so. And that's a very good example that you brought up, Gordon. And I think it really exemplifies this idea of scapegoating, right? Which really plays not only in like anti-Asian racism, but just xenophobia and kind of very strong nationalist sentiments. And we've seen we're seeing this right now with whether it's with COVID or with previous epidemics or pandemics. We've seen, for example, during the 9/11 incident in the United States, how afterwards the discord completely shifted to any Muslim individual.
Right. You band together against like a common enemy almost that you perceive as a common enemy.
Yeah. Entering year 2 of this pandemic, we've seen everything under the rainbow. If any, it's literally like anything that could have
has happened.
It seemed to have happened. Yeah. And so, I guess in your opinion, like what do you think are some of the causes or factors that have kind of exacerbated this? Because we've like I mentioned earlier with my own example, like I've experienced and I continue to experience racism, whether it's in the workplace, in the community, but it all seems to be very covert, very behind the scenes kind of thing. But with COVID, everything kind of is put on a table and very in your face.
Yeah. I think even just if I think about an example before COVID and then transition that to during COVID, I remember, I won't say what workplace it was, but I work with someone who was of Asian descent, and I remember the gentleman when he came in to access services was basically like, hey, can you tell that Oriental lady that I need something or whatever? And I was like, I'm the only, there's 2 of us in the store at that time, and you could have simply just referred to them as, can you tell the lady, or whatever called by the profession. There was no need for that attempt to even put a racial identifier out there. Maybe you're ignorant to the fact that could be offensive to a lot of populations, but it wasn't even necessary in that scenario. So just to even understand that and that's what we were talking about, Will, like that covert, implicit thing that came from an implicit place that where the person didn't even realize that's a very offensive thing to even say. And that COVID-19 comes now where very prominent people now have normalized that's okay. I always say to you, to people, sometimes you have thoughts, right? That's why a lot of us are blessed with the ability to think. You have thoughts, and then you check them, you realize that they're not very good thoughts, incorrect, and then you kind of squish it. Right? That's normal. The fact that you have a racist thought that comes up and you're able to deal with it right away doesn't mean you're a horrible person. Okay? You just have to realize it was wrong and you don't let it see the light of day. So now when you have COVID-19 that comes and it's okay to, giving a voice to the voiceless, and in this case, the voiceless, rightly so, should continue to remain voiceless because very oppressive and harmful things that they have to say. In that case, now they have a voice and they realize that there's not a lot of repercussions, especially if you talk about United States with hate speech. Hate speech is technically basically protected under the freedom of speech. So technically you can, spread hateful speech, and then hateful speech then breeds that, more discrimination, prejudice, acts of violence. And we know in even researching this topic, a hate crime is a very specific term, which it seems like it's very hard to prove and get people prosecuted on a hate crime. So there's a lot of challenges for sure.
Taking that a step further, when you're having the former president of the United States saying the things he did, calling it the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, he has a big platform, and his voice and his sound bites are going across the news, across media, and if you're a citizen of that country, or even you're hearing this from other countries, you're going to say, okay, maybe someone with authority said this, maybe this is true, maybe this is what I should do, maybe I should call it, and it gets propagated in that way. So it's very important to consider that. But as we see, it doesn't just stop with the former U.S. president. This is being used across several leaders and politicians across the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like, it really shows how, for a lot of people, I'm sure there are some people out there who really just don't have the access to the information or whatever. And when they hear, like, essentially the person of highest authority in the most developed nation in the world, kind of utilizing these racist statements and making these accusations, then it's exactly like you said, Rashan. It's almost, they almost feel like it's like a pass. It's if they said it, why can't I?
But you know what? I think that's understating it a bit, because as I mentioned before, people make mistakes. Unfortunately, that's something baked into our human existence. Maybe it was an implicit bias. Maybe that's how they truly feel. The reality is, numerous times, like you mentioned, LaShawn, the president was told that this is a very dangerous type of language to be using, and he refused because it was being done intentional, crossing out on his briefings and renaming it. Like, I want people to know this is where it came from, and it's all your fault. That was the message he was saying. I wouldn't even call it a covert hidden message. That's what it really, people refer to it as dog whistle. That wasn't even a dog whistle, it was just a whistle. Right? So there's a lot of intent there. Like, the worst types of racism is when there's the hurt with the intent behind it. And those ones are harder and more dangerous to combat.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. And referring it to it as the whistle, as you did, Gordon. I think that's really hits the nail on the head there. It really isn't anything covert at that point. And I think shifting our direction here a bit. I really wanted to talk about this. So I recently kind of came across this issue when researching the topic. About anti-Asian racism versus the myth of Asian privilege, right? And for me, it was very interesting. Kind of through my research, it showed there were many studies and reports that which showed that pre-pandemic and pre kind of the recent events that have occurred against the Asian community. The dominant discourse was that Asians were less, it's less about Asians and racism and Asians, being the victims of racism, and more about Asians being privileged, the Asians having privilege, things like that. And, I think especially in the US, and I would assume even so in Canada to some extent, that the Asian community, and I'm speaking broadly Asian here, is identified as the model minority or the model community. Is this a term that folks here are familiar with?
Yeah, and the more you dig deeper into it, the more problematic you see the word that term is.
It really is a myth.
Yeah.
For the model minority, it's clearly a term that's coined by those in power, right? By the dominant, by kind of your privileged white people, because they're the majority. And so the term model minority refers to as the minority group that should be considered almost the standard in which all other minority groups strive to be. And so in this case, the Asian community is considered that where by their hard work and by their efforts and etc., they have gotten to a point or a place in society, and that everything that they've done is by their own merit. And so every other minority group who hasn't hit that level should essentially pick up your game.
Yeah. So even I have to be honest, until I researched, I was familiar with the term. I wasn't sure exactly kind of how the term got coined or developed. And you almost assume then, it's something that the Asian community kind of put out there. They're very proud that they were able to achieve success, put your head down, so to speak, and then move through all these challenges and not complain too much, all those little stereotypical things that go out there. But really it was, from my understanding, it was a piece written by William Peterson in 1966, and essentially it was highlighting the success story of a Japanese family, immigrating 20 years, and then I think they became a very successful family. So the piece was put out there. It was first kind of a look how good Japanese immigrants are. Then it became Asian in general, and then but when you dig deep into it, this came out around the same time as the civil rights movement in the 60s. So what it really was designed to do is be propaganda. So it turned into, hey, you black people who are very upset about what's going on, look at these Asians who have came here and not complained or did anything hectic like what your guys are doing. Why can't you do that? So now that takes the focus of attention now off the white supremacists, the white people in power, and then in turn then pits black communities and Asian communities against each other because of that tension and that reality, where none of them were complicit even in that narrative in the first place.
So then it's everybody against the marginalized groups against each other,
fighting for limited resources,
rather than everybody against white supremacy. Yes, yeah. And that we see that today too. The same rhetoric continues today, even when we talk about trying to build awareness about anti-Asian racism. We hear complaints or we hear people comparing to protests last summer with Black Lives Matter, or we hear indigenous communities, people will say, oh, well, what about them? Well, what about them? All these what about isms. But it's like, it's the same goal overall, which is dismantling white supremacy. But people in power can benefit a lot from distractions of saying, well, actually, we aren't your enemy. It's that group over there that's causing this problem. And so I think it's good that we bring it up so that we can stay focused. And yes, right now we are focusing on anti-Asian racism, but other communities are not threats to each other.
And then if you think of just the Rodney King riots in the 90s, it was the police, beating up a black man. Then it turned into almost like a race war in very deprived communities where you have, there's people of Asian descent, black communities, and then white people essentially sit there eating popcorn, right? So it's just something we have to realize that it's designed to pit people against each other, where there's really this narrative is not coming from those communities themselves. It's from the people in power.
Yeah, and I guess another thing that I came across as well was, when you think of this idea of this model community or this model minority, maybe some people might think that it's a good thing. Oh wow, this group is overachieving and like they're very hardworking. But like with that, the same kind of idea in line with that comes with the idea that these individuals are not capable of creativity or have emotional intelligence, and that also leads to a problem because it very much prevents them from obtaining these higher organizational leadership positions. And there's many studies that kind of show that these Asian Americans aren't a part of the aren't CEOs of different organizations, and they don't have that higher level position because of these model minority kind of narratives and stereotypes preventing that from even putting them into consideration.
You've done well, be satisfied with what you have, move on. That kind of undertone to it, very much so.
We've seen a clear increase in xenophobic ideas, and kind of the growth of ultra nationalist sentiments across the world. It's not just as much as the Asian community is a target. I personally think that it's all vulnerable populations often just get branded as the scapegoat, right? So we've seen, in Europe during the early phases of the pandemic, places like Italy, Spain, the UK, etc., where people of Asian descent, East Asian descent, or whatever, being singled out. But then you also, moving to, let's say, places like the Middle East, you have already vulnerable populations like the migrant workers, like people from South Asia who are there for for work be, kind of people pointing the fingers and being like, okay, these people are the source of the virus, and it's very much like a global issue, and it's just kind of like a humankind issue.
Yep, and just a case in point for that, I won't say. So there was a restaurant in London, Ontario, that had a sign up a couple months ago, that said, I'm gonna quote here: "We love Chinese people. We hate the genocide and China virus your communist government has inflicted on us." So when you talk about xenophobia, I mean, you can put that right beside it, the definition in a dictionary.
I think for me, when I see messages like this, I also look and I also start thinking about what the impacts these might have for future generations, right? It's like, imagine if you're kind of a youth or a younger person growing up right now, and all you hear on, whether it's on social media or even just as you're walking around on signs, is just that this very, strong hatred towards Asian Canadians. It's you're at a stage where things like this sticks, and
yeah, absolutely.
It's just and I think it just snowballs into problems in the future.
But you know why it's problematic for two reasons, right? So it's problematic because, and I think that restaurant's actually near a couple schools, by the way, so that's problematic in of itself. So it's problematic because if you're of Chinese or Asian descent, you can internalize that in a negative way. That's not good for your well-being. And then if you're a white person, you can internalize that to perpetuate it even more, because it's maybe this is feeding into a bias that you already have, and then you're then able to, that gives you a bit of a liberty to then feel and say and act in a way that confirms these harmful beliefs. And then the people who it's targeted against are scared for their lives, essentially, and then you get that further divide. So it's problematic in two ways.
Yeah.
And especially with COVID, I think just creating that element of fear surrounding Asian communities is especially problematic, because in many places too, a lot of racialized communities and specifically Asian communities are disproportionately affected by COVID. And so then it's like no one cares because you brought this virus here. And in Alberta specifically, the outbreaks in our meat plants have been some of the largest in North America. And one particular plant, they have a very large migrant worker population, and specifically a large Filipino population. And, unfortunately, due to, occupational hazards and all the things like that, it's just been a very prominent hotspot of COVID, and a lot of their employees have been impacted. And rather than, the general society, showing sympathy, support, trying to solve this issue, instead, the people who are sick have then been blamed for it. It's like, well, you brought this virus here. We don't care that you're suffering. And I'm like, how did we get here? And at the same time, like I said earlier, why are we surprised? Like, we have shown from time that these stereotypes and policy changes are so harmful.
One of the things that brings up, especially in light of COVID-19 and kind of bringing together this anti-Asian racism element to it, it's the idea that in the news media, you see so many different stories. And like, I don't know if you've all have seen the videos of elderly Asian gentlemen being pushed, or women being pushed and assaulted. They're just minding their own business, and you have an assault take place where they get pushed and just punched and beaten down. And, when these type of things occur, when people are watching this, they don't feel safe. And when you're talking about COVID-19 and, you're wondering if you can access health services or go for a walk, you might feel scared, right? You can't do the regular things that you want to do. And this leads to more isolation. And, even on top of that, I came across this term. It's called vicarious trauma. And it's this idea that, when you're exposed to these constant stories and videos about people who look like you, share similar traits, racial groups, ethnic groups, and even part of the same gender, you start to kind of, there's detrimental effects to that.
Internalize
It's affecting your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. You internalize it. There's mental health consequences that arise from that. And that kind of propagates this whole idea, and you get the feeling of not feeling safe, and, being scared to access regular services in the community because this is what's going on.
Racial trauma is real, for sure.
Yeah. With COVID, still being active as ever, I'm very, very much, very cautious about the future post COVID. Whether it's, the growth of anti-immigrant sentiments, whether the growth of ultra-nationalist ideologies, or all sorts of these ideas. It's going to be a problematic future, to say the least. And I wonder, I really wonder. This is something that kind of came to my mind last year when early on in the pandemic, when at least here in Canada, I think there were reports of things like masks, PPE, not having enough supplies because Canada got most of its supply from places like China, in places in Asia where the pandemic was starting off and going really hard. It was the idea of whether countries will revert back to very isolationist kind of policies. We're kind of seeing some snippets of it here and there with the vaccine rollout, where of countries' vaccine nationalism.
That's literally racism, but like at a geopolitical level. Not even like, we talk about socio-ecological model. Maybe there's that sixth thing where it's like geopolitical, because that's like the power player, where you can have a United States as a power player, allocating resources, shifting resources, affecting entire continents. That's something at a scale that I don't know if just linking it back to public health, I don't even know if it's something that we're even equipped to even deal with.
It also, though, brings to mind the way we exploit a lot of our labor, a lot of our, we outsource everything in Canada, really. How often do we make things here anyway? We outsource everything, exploiting people, paying next to nothing. And at the same time, when you mentioned when there's a crisis, when there's a pandemic, it's so easy then to have these narratives that fuel more xenophobic sentiments. But I wonder too how much of that is our own fault for exploiting lower income countries to make everything for us, and then and that's another topic of discussion, but it's just another layer of this power.
No, but do you think of this might be a little bit more maybe a superficial example, but a lot of what the PPE we use so you don't want Asians in your country, but then you're going to use the PPE that they make to protect you. So that's what I mean. You just have to, I know that people function, people have different levels of education and all that stuff, but let's just, maybe the first thing that comes to your head is not the right thing. Look, there's chances are you have a phone or internet, do some research, talk to someone, and let's not do the easy thing. The easy thing is to just be scared of all Asians because something came from Wuhan. That's the easy thing to do. The thing you should do is ask yourself, why? Did you know that something like the swine flu basically started in North America? Do you want the same kind of energy if when the shoe's on the other foot? So you guys got to think through these things as human being and not just do the easy thing and pick the easy thing to do.
Yeah, and have conversations. If you hear someone, friends, family, or if you see something in public, if it's safe, step in, say something, because your voice, as cliche as it sounds, does make a difference. And so if you're able to just interfere and disrupt even one act of racism, and specifically in this context, anti-Asian racism, that does make a difference.
Yeah. It's one small sliver of hope, and one small positivity. I don't even want to call it a positivity, because it's still in the context of anti-Asian racism that I've kind of noticed is at least in the US, it really I think this recent wave has really brought a lot of communities together. And you know, just you know, as problematic as it is to generalize all Asians, there's also still some strength in, you know, kind of falling under the same umbrella, and you know, along with other marginalized populations like the Black community, like the Latinx community, you're able to, you know, really come together and, just like you said, Winda, work together to not against one another, but against the system that's, you know, that's held us all here, you know, and restricted any sort of growth or anything like that. And something that really kind of tugged at my heartstrings was recently in the West Coast, at least in the U.S., there's been a lot of organized kind of initiatives of younger Asian American and Pacific Islander, you know, youth, or, you know, young people who've kind of banded together to almost provide kind of a safety patrol for these elderly people, you know, and just really coming together as a community to keep them safe. Yeah, it was definitely, you know, really emotional to see, and especially just kind of that generational gap kind of being closed, and really, you know, realizing that we're all here together and fighting, you know, fighting as one and for the same cause.
Yeah, I completely I can't say it much better than what you've just said. I think the key thing that I've noticed as well is that all the little schemes are being kind of uncovered. People are more aware now of what the system kind of intentionally does to put people against each other and keep people oppressed. So instead of you know, those misdirections and distractions hopefully don't work as much, we kind of stay focused on the goal. Hey, white supremacy, which is basically just saying the field is not level for everyone. It's not saying that if you're white, you're just an inherently bad person and you don't have any kind of moral compass or anything. It just, the society is set up so that it's not a level playing field for everybody. And I'm seeing now, hopefully, that, you know, people of color now are working toward just leveling. So fighting for Black causes is the same thing as fighting for all minority causes, and, you know, fighting against anti-Asian racism is also going to further the Black cause. And we're seeing a lot a more shared collective goal towards, like, just advancing all peoples that are systemically oppressed. And I think that's my hope, coming from going out of COVID-19 into hopefully a better world.
Unfortunately, the way our governments and our societies are set up, change does not happen without evidence. Anecdotes don't help, and sensational news stories only last for the 24-hour news cycle. And so there's this website called covidracism.ca where they are collecting reports of racism in the wake of COVID, and it's predominantly anti-Asian racism that we're seeing, but anyone can report a racist incident that they see. And so I heard of this through the Chinese Canadian National Council, the Toronto chapter. And so they have been doing a lot of work to, one, bring awareness to how COVID has been racialized, and two, to help gather evidence to bring this to light. And so if anyone is witness to or experiences a racist attack in Canada, please go to this website, covidracism.ca, and you can then report it. And this data can be collected so that we can track what's happening.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our content and would like to stay up to date, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. To learn more about our community initiatives and how you can support us, visit our website at thepublichealthinsight.com. Join the PHI community, and let's make public health viral.